In this lesson, we'll be talking about a bit of both formats of critical reasoning prompts, inference and argumentation, when it comes to completing the prompts as your question task. So let's first just differentiate between the types of prompts that you'll see in the verbal reasoning section as it pertains to critical reasoning format questions. Argument prompts, of course, are going to provide an explicit main conclusion. That's the main way that you'll be able to identify. An argument prompt is that you're being asked to address some sort of subjective opinion that functions as the conclusion. There are multiple possible tasks that can affect or address the argument. You might be asked to explain an argument. You might be asked to strengthen, weaken, identify a flaw. There's a bunch of different tasks, but they're all ultimately going to involve dealing with the conclusion and addressing it or affecting it in some fashion. You'll usually have to evaluate the validity of the argument, meaning how sound it is, whether or not you believe the subjective position or opinion it presents. You'll have to apply any new information in the choices to the argument as true. You don't want to get into a semantic argument about what the veracity of the answer choice is. Each of the argument task question stems are generally going to have the caveat if true, so you just have to accept the information as true and see what that information would do to the argument. And you will consider your common arguments and assumptions that are in one of our other lessons because they often can help expedite your evaluation of an argument prompt. And whatever the argument prompt task is, you're going to want to predict broadly what the answer should do to that argument, explanation, opinion, position to address the task directly. Now, your inference prompts are a little bit different. First, there is no conclusion presented. So when you've got an inference task, it ultimately, very similar in fashion to the reading comprehension, is going to be asking some version of what must be, and you just have empirical statements of fact without a conclusion. So you have to track those statements of fact. And that single task for the inference style critical reasoning prompts is going to be the same as it is for inference tasks and reading comprehension, and that's what must be without any additional information. When it comes to inference tasks in the critical reasoning format, it is going to be nearly impossible to predict. So you want to just stick to the facts and find a choice that, when it is compared to the facts, must be 100% certain without exception. So there are two different ways you can be asked to complete a prompt. And you can see with the example on the left-hand side, we've just got a blank and then a period. And the question is asking, which of the following best completes the passage above? Because we always go to the task first. So here, if we read the paragraph up until the blank, population variability can be divided into rare traits, which are generally influenced by negative selection, and frequent traits, which are especially important in evolutionary terms because they reflect positive selective agents and blank. This is just a bunch of facts. There's a lot of them, but there's no subjective conclusion provided. We just have that scenario of facts providing information, and then you've got to take that information to logically complete the statement. All of the information that's provided in this little paragraph, we can reasonably believe, even though we probably don't have background necessarily, at least I don't, on population variability and how to divide it into rare traits and frequent traits. But I can't believe that these are viable facts. And the single question task is what must be to conclude the prompt. So based on the explicit statements of fact that came before the blank, we've got to find an answer choice that has to be true. And the 5 answer choices are presented to cross check against the statements of fact as either reasonably certain, meaning without exception, or not definitively plausible. So when we start with choice A, appear less often as genetic markers. Well, we don't actually compare the frequent traits, which are especially important in evolutionary terms because they reflect selective agents. And actually, this is backwards, right? We're talking about frequent traits, so less often would be a reversal. So beware of reversals. Make sure that you're understanding the information directly. Now, predict the likelihood of extinction of an individual species. We're not talking about extinction explicitly, so this would go too far. It would be extreme. Choice C, negate the impact of rare traits. That would make it seem like they counteract them directly, basically make them null, and that's not stated, and we can eliminate that as being extreme. Can furnish uniquely valuable information about population. Well, in the paragraph, it said frequent traits are especially important in evolutionary terms because they reflect positive selective agents, and we want to find an answer that says, furthermore, why they're especially important, and this does. Can furnishes a nice bland statement and uniquely valuable information about the population. We're talking about population variability, so this seems to be logically definitive, even though it's unstated. And then choice E, become increasingly selective as time passes. Well, we don't know that it becomes increasingly selective, they're just there. So we'd have to have some outside knowledge. We'd be making too big of a comparison. So we can eliminate choice E. And you can see, even with relatively obscure scientific content, you just have to stick to the terms in the little paragraph and find something that is definitively certain based on the information if you were being asked to complete an inference style prompt with just statements of fact and no subjective opinion. So we've got another example here, and this is going to be what we like to call a since strengthen. So we've got a subjective argument provided requiring further support here, and we've got that here if we read the full paragraph to the highlighted sentence. So Amazonian rural groups are in the process of a transition from a more traditional to a more westernized lifestyle, leading to nutritional and epidemiological challenges. Unfortunately, a lack of public policies sensitive to their reality will make them continue to suffer for the decades to come. Now, some of the since strengthen style questions will explicitly refer to an argument, and if you see that, then you clearly know that it's got to be an argument style prompt, even though it's asking you to complete the prompt itself with the blank. But here, we just note the unfortunately, and there's this more subjective tone that we don't necessarily believe without further evidence. And if you think about the way the word since works, we know that whatever comes after the since has to be the reasoning or the support. And so if we just had a little thought experiment, if I said Stefan needs to go to the store since, well, the conclusion is I need to go to the store. The since is going to introduce whatever my whatever my support is going to be for that claim that I need to go to the store. So here, anything that comes after the since needs to strengthen the argument that largely came directly before the blank as it did here. So when you got a since strengthen, the evidence should be provided to support the claim immediately prior to the transition term, whether it's since or potentially because as well, because that too can be an indicator term. And the implicit question task is what information would provide direct support to the preceding claim. So we're basically looking again to strengthen. And we've got our 5 choices that we must consider as true to determine which would best improve the argument, in this case, to show that a lack of public policies sensitive to the Amazonian rural groups and their reality will make these groups continue to suffer for the decades to come. So we start with choice A. Westernized lifestyles are known to be not preferred by some societies. There's that delightfully vague phrasing of some societies. I don't know if that includes the Amazonian rural groups or not, so we can eliminate choice A pretty directly. Then choice B, viruses are a primary concern for researchers in the Amazon rainforest. Well, that's great, but now we've introduced this new variable of researchers that requires additional information and doesn't definitively affect the Amazonian rural groups who are going to be struggling here. So we can eliminate choice B. Then international groups have begun lobbying on behalf of these rural groups. Well, if the international groups are lobbying on their behalf, then it seems like someone is sensitive to their reality. So that's going to be a reversal. It actually weakens the conclusion. Then we have choice D, rural groups are underrepresented in Amazonian governing bodies. Well, this explains the claim directly by showing that the rural groups don't have a say in the governmental policies. So that shows why those public policies will make them continue to suffer for the decades to come. So choice D matches our prediction pretty well. And then public policies in the Amazon are often dictated by corporate interests. We need additional information. Even if we apply this, it would largely seem to weaken the argument or strengthen. It's really hard to tell because we don't know whether the corporate interests are going to be for the rural groups or not. You might make an unwarranted assumption to say that the corporate interests are negative, but they might not be. So we can't determine that this is definitively anti-Amazonian rural groups, whereas choice D specifically says they lack representation. So D is going to be better than E, even though you might make a logical leap and try to validate the corporate interests. It doesn't say explicitly that the corporate interests are going to counter the rural group's realities and make them suffer. So, how do we identify critical reasoning support? Well, when you're trying to support an argument, this is ultimately a strengthen test, being asked to strengthen whatever the conclusion is. And you can identify the choices as being intended to support the prompt. So that's what the correct answer should do when you are supporting an argument. You have to apply the choices as true to determine the impact on the argument's conclusion in the paragraph. And oftentimes, the supporting an argument task is going to be identifiable by the word argument in the question stem. And ultimately, if you have to take the support and go up into the argument or the paragraph to determine whether the choice does effectively support that paragraph, you're looking at a strengthened question ultimately, even though we're using the somewhat ambiguous term of support. Now, you could also be asked to support a choice. And in this case, the support goes the other direction. And this is when there's no conclusion presented, as was the circumstance with our first example. You're going to have only statements of fact that are presented, and they are going to support one of the following. And that often is a phrase that you'll see. And then it's going to be some sort of not really deep inference, but some basic inference that must be. And you've got that single possible task of what must be, and it can be either what must be true or what must be false. And so ultimately, if you have to take the information in the paragraph and move it down to support something in the choices, that's an inference task, not a strengthen task. So beware of the word support and recognize that it could be indicating a strengthen task if we have an argument, if the prompt contains a conclusion, or it could be asking you to support a choice, in which case you're just ultimately looking for an inference that is 100% certain. So, our completing prompts process. First, if a conclusion is present, it's a since strengthen task. If there is no conclusion present, then you're looking at an inference task. With a strengthen task, you're going to want to read the prompt and note the exact conclusion or conclusions. There could potentially be more than one. And with an inference task, you want to read the prompt and simply shorthand note your statements of fact. Step 3 is only if you're dealing with a since strengthen when it comes to completing the prompt, and that's when you want to broadly predict what the answer should do to strengthen the argument, and that argument is likely coming immediately before the blank that you're being asked to fill in. And then step 4, you know that our common wrong strengthen answers are going to be our common wrong argument task answers. Reverse impacts, so in this case, weaken rather than strengthen. Vague impacts, additional information needed to evaluate the impact, and no impact either way. And then our common wrong inference answers are going to be reversals of the information. Something that goes too far is an extreme inference, and something that seems reasonable but isn't definitively certain, kind of like that example with the corporate interests pertaining to the Amazonian rural groups. We weren't sure, so that made it incorrect. So now, let's go on over to the whiteboard and take a look at how we'll execute with our Scratch work when we encounter these completing prompts, inference, and argument style questions on the Gmat Focus Edition verbal reasoning section. As always, we'll start by setting up our Scratch work. We've got A through E. We put a little line over top and we see that word of support. So we've got to determine the proper direction of the support. And it says, which of the following is most supported by the given information above? So we know that our direction of support is going down. So that means we're looking at an inference task, which means we can just summarize what we're being asked to do as finding something that must be given the information above. So we're going to write out a few fact statements, 1, 2, and 3. If we need more, we'll get them. And just start taking shorthand notes. So liver size has been identified as a good indicator of how healthy a rat is. Okay, so we know that liver size indicates rat health. All right, learn something new every day. And that unwell rats generally have larger livers than do healthy rats. So if we got a bigger liver, so an increase in liver size, that's going to be equal to a unwell rat. Furthermore, in a recently concluded riparian wildlife study, this is one of those words where you're like, if I know what it means, great. If you don't even worry about what kind of wildlife study it is. Just say riparian, or even shorthanded in your head as our wildlife study. I'm not going to get into that if I don't know what the term means. I'm just going to skip over. So, furthermore, in a recently concluded R wildlife study, biologists found that most river rats that had been killed by predators had substantially larger livers than did river rats killed accidentally. So, this is just going to be our wildlife study. A little arrow, though, there says that RR for river rats with large livers killed more frequently by predators. So, found that river rats that had been killed by predators had substantially, all right, we'll even put substantially up here. And so we'll just say substantial larger livers. Simple enough. So we know that larger livers had or been killed by predators than river rats killed accidentally. So accidental and accident. So accidental are our deaths, smaller livers. So now we want to go to our answer choices and find something that 100% must be without any additional information. So healthy river rats cannot be caught by most airborne predators. Well, we've completely introduced a new variable here of airborne predators, so that needs additional information. You can find a choice A. Larger livers prevent river rats from escaping predators. So again, this seems potentially reasonable, but prevent is going to be extreme. We don't know that all river rats with larger rivers get caught by predators. Then choice C, healthy rats never possess a liver larger than that of an unhealthy rat. Well, again, we've got that never, so that's going to be extreme. We can eliminate choice C. Choice D is a bit of a trap because it says river rat predators can differentiate a healthy rat from a sickly one. This may seem reasonable, like, hey, they can tell. It doesn't have to be that way. They could just be better at catching them and not even know that that's the case. So make sure you check all 5 choices at all times because this is possible, but that does not mean that it's certain. Whereas choice E, healthy river rats are less likely to be captured by a predator than are unhealthy ones. And that is 100% what is stated and matches our facts. That the larger livers get killed more frequently, and so healthy river rats are less likely to be captured. And choice E is basically the flip side of the coin. Be careful, make sure you check everything. But you can see when you're being asked to find information that is supported from the paragraph, even if you're not technically completing the prompt, you kind of are by just finding something that's definitively true from the statements of fact alone. So let's scroll on down and take a look at an actual completing the prompt structure here just below on the board. So this time, same setup, A, B, C, D, E, put a little line over top, and we see the word argument, and so that tells us that this has to be a sense strengthened. And they use the term because instead of since, but because really does function as a sense here. So we just have to read the paragraph, and we're going to put a little PS for predicted strengthened, and we've got to find something that shows the conclusion is viable. So, or makes the conclusion seem more viable. As new technologies penetrate nearly all industries, people who can adapt to new tools at their jobs prosper, while those who cannot are rendered obsolete. Nonetheless, it is clear that simply resisting new technology cannot prevent job loss because blank. Okay, so our predicted strength then is just going to be to find info to show that resisting new tech does not equal stop job loss. So we want to strengthen what came immediately before the blank in the prompt, and that's it is clear that simply resisting new technology cannot stop job loss. So that's what we need to find, something to support that statement. So because choice A, companies that don't evolve are often driven out of business by more agile competitors. Well, that seems to be it, doesn't it? Because that shows that without the new tech, there's lots of jobs lost when the company goes out of business. And when you're able to come up proactively with a good check in like A or B, you can, again, just move more briskly through the remaining. So we'll do that here. The initial costs, well, of implementing new technologies can be onerous to smaller businesses. Smaller businesses, I don't know how many there are. You might get into trouble by not knowing what onerous is, but focusing on just the smaller business aspect means that we need additional information about smaller businesses. We don't know if that's all of our businesses, if it's a large percentage or not. Choice C, training programs required to successfully adopt new technologies are not always subsidized. Well, not always subsidized could not be more vague if we tried, so that's out. There is always a subsequent technology being developed in this era of planned obsolescence. Well, there just being another subsequent technology, again, needs additional information. Because does that mean that we could stop or not? I have no idea. And then unemployment benefits, well, that goes outside of the construct of the argument entirely. So that too would need additional information. And you don't have to go as deeply into these answer choices once choice A seems like a good match, showing that just not adapting is not going to make the job loss stop. So you've seen how to work through both our inference style questions and our argument style questions when it comes to completing prompts. Remember the direction of support as you practice more of these problems on your own to improve at this aspect of the verbal reasoning section of the Gmat focus.